The tipping point between the reptilian brain and the empathic brain is analogous to a tight bud and an open blossom. Now, an open blossom has tremendous potential for the plant, for the surrounding ecology, relative to the tight bud. But it also has exposed vulnerability. One of the reasons that buds don't open in the frost of winter is that if they do, if there's a, and I'm referencing New York State climate, but if there's a warm January or February, and then there's a very cold frost, the entire crop, the entire synergy emerging out of that orchard, that plant, that flower is lost. Because while you have the possibility for synergy, in a blossom you have fragility. And it's no different than the space phenomena when SpaceX sends a rocket into the atmosphere and puts enormous thrust and puts two fairings around satellites that would otherwise rip to pieces at 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 miles an hour. And so you have a protective period of high force. And then you move out into orbit. You break the gravitational pull of the status quo. And that's when the satellites can become butterflies, can unroll their solar panels, because there's not even 60 miles an hour wind. When we run our hand outside of the car at 60 miles an hour, there's a chance of whipping the arm back and breaking a wrist because there's great force. At 1,000 miles an hour, the body is torn to pieces in that type of wind, and certainly upon impact with water. But out in the space of possibility, out in the terrain of the other, you have incredible grace once you've broken orbit. And this is mirrored with the eruption, with the propulsion away from the reptilian brain. It's one of the most significant occurrences in the history of the planet, because the reptilian brain fights what is smaller than it, runs from what is bigger than it, and freezes when neither of those two options are available. It's a brain out of fear, and it is a sociopathic brain in the sense that a reptile would rather eat a 5-year-old child than eat a grown man, because the grown man might put up more of a fight, because the 5-year-old child is easier prey. A human being, however, defined with the distinction between the reptilian brain and the empathic brain, would often save the life of the 5-year-old while risking or sacrificing their own. This is particularly the case when we come to the transcendent brain. You have the reptilian brain. We have an enormous milestone as we move into the rational reptile, the rational sociopath. This is where the sociopath becomes more and more competent with pattern analysis. The biggest 180 by far in human evolution which is also our species evolution, because human beings are the sex organs of the planet. In order for sex to take place, You have a tremendous agitation and a projection of patterns of energy capable of giving birth to new life. For the planet to have sex, it must generate an organ that is capable of projecting new patterns of life into the cosmos, into the solar system, into the universe. And just like with a sperm and a fetus, millions of sperm must go into the probability field, must make their way up the fallopian tubes, must, like dandelion seeds upon the wind, fall on hard rocks, fall in salty water, fall in putrid used motor oil tubs, fall on concrete, fall on rooftops, and wither. But among those 1,000 seeds, 3, 4, 5, 10 land on fertile soil by sheer grace. And landing, the dandelion perpetuates. The dandelion that was 1 is now the dandelion that is 5. And there are now 5 patterns of energy working to transform light into soil, doing their job. The sex organ of a planet may need to send millions, if not thousands, of probes and life specimens out into the universe, out into the solar system. Some to go in black holes, some to land, some to be buried on the moon, some to be buried on Mars, some to go out into space without the energy to return, containing biology, containing DNA, containing the raw material of life. Some of these may be picked up 1,000 years from now by another spacefaring civilization or by ourselves in a more evolved state, taken out of the grain and with far more superior technology than our own, a new planet, gestated from nothing to everything in a few million years, in 10,000 years, using the coding of energy and matter developed in the billion-year software of life. In order to develop an organ capable of giving birth to new life on different planets, we need to reach a point of intelligence. We need to reach a point of grace, capable of developing patterns of energy that are efficient enough to be projected out into space and sustain the ecology. Meaning some animals kill the host during the act of sex. Praying mantis, certain fish, salmon, die in the act of giving birth. And I suppose that could be the human fate, to die giving birth to an inefficient off-child, an inefficient offspring that, in its leap from the planet, consumes too much energy. But it need not be our fate. The majority of life's creatures give birth to offspring in one form or another and become something more in the process. Learn about care, learn about skill, learn about to protect. Because as we move from the rational sociopath into the rational empath, you could say that a child is born as an irrational empath, as an irrational transcendent being in a sociopathic environment that is unattuned to sustain the dominance of the empathic and transcendent regions of the brain. Through childhood trauma and violation, the child descends into the reptilian brain, in the terror of loneliness and the panic of survival, and begins to lift towards rationality. The child learns to manipulate, to dominate, to protect the reptiles around it in order to survive, feel secure, experience love and belonging. The reptilian brain, informed by rationality, moves towards competence, moves towards something more than just survival and security, moves towards love and belonging. And at a certain point in that journey, of love and belonging, abundance occurs. An abundance of survival, an abundance of security of survival. An abundance occurs. And in that abundance, the retirement, the letting go of the sociopathic elements necessary for survival and security in a sociopathic environment, and the emergence of a landscape that's more fun, an emergence of the empathic and the transcendent brain. Now there's a very, very delicate pivot point when the temperature of abundance becomes warm enough that we cease from preying on that which is smaller than us, running from that which is bigger than us, and freezing. We cease from dominating and manipulating out of fear, guilt, shame, intimidation. We move towards empathy. Now, empathy is based on trust and trustworthiness, because empathy is the ecological brain. The individual has the reptilian brain. The sociopath has the individual brain, because a sociopath considers nothing but themselves. a sociopath does not include awareness of their interconnectedness with the larger ecology of human beings, of species, and of the planet. A sociopath in the reptilian brain is at war in a fight, flight, freeze, please dynamic with its ecology, with other people, in a terrain of fear. As human beings master competency, master intelligence, which increases the efficiency with which energy, time, money, and natural resources are and is transformed into human well-being. That efficiency leads to a certain amount of abundance. That abundance leads to a certain amount of warmth. And the big moment of emergence of the empathic brain is the ice melting. As the temperature increases, as the fire burns, as the abundance of heat emerges, layers upon layers of ice melt away. And the frozen, dissociated empathic brain, caught in the clutches of trauma, comes back online. As it does so in a paradigm of abundance, it becomes trustworthy. An empath is the only trustworthy person. Now, there's an artificial split between love and competency that says, would you rather have a sociopathic jerk who's a brain surgeon and the best in the world operate on your child, or would you rather have an effusive, warm, 20-something, very nice bed manner, beautiful, with no brain surgery operate on your child? But this is a misunderstanding about a false dissociation between competency and love, between competency and empathy. And the misunderstanding is this: if you care deeply about anything, the adult takes time. That's the first face of adult love. Caring, loving enough to care, caring enough to take time. Taking time enough to see, and seeing enough to understand, and understanding enough to empathize, and empathizing enough to attune. That is the face of competency. Oh, you're so lovely. I love you so much. I've got to go. Bye. Bye. I don't see you. I'm committed to not seeing you. I don't understand you. I don't empathize with something I do not understand. I do not attune to what I understand because I don't understand. And I fail to love and be loving to you because I don't understand. Competency and love go hand in hand. What we sometimes see is that in a world that is largely reptilian, meaning the human species is at a transition point, where large portions of its software, large portions of its program are reptilian. You go into a bank and you really need money, and you can get none. You go into a bank and you've got billions, and you can borrow billions. That's sociopathic. You desperately need medical care and have absolutely no money, and you cannot get medical care. You have lots of money and barely, you just need your nails polished or adjusted, or have dental surgeons change the angle of your tooth, and you can find the finest people in the world. That's sociopathic. Empathy begins with the question, who's in the most pain? How can I help? Why? Because empathy is the ecological brain. The ecological brain accurately perceives the fact that we are interconnected with one another and interconnected with our environment. The sociopathic brain accurately perceives that we are dissociated from everything in a war with our environment. The dissociation is from the ecological brain, meaning all trauma that is unresolved and unhealed leads to dissociation. All dissociation is a dissociation from the empathic centers of the brain, which are capable of understanding and attuning ecologically. And in order not to upset the balance, because if this finger understands that it belongs in the same ecology as this hand, this finger will not destroy the hand. But if this hand is sociopathically dissociated from its larger ecology, its body, if it identifies with itself as a hand rather than part of a body, the ingredients of a sociopath are there. Now this hand can intelligently attack this finger, can see this finger as a threat, as competition for food support, because of the sociopathic paradigm. This hand is now the biggest threat to this finger because it's bigger than the finger. It utilizes the law of mass. The law of mass is not intelligent, but it is sociopathic, meaning when the bully with 5 gang members gangs up on the smallest, often the most innocent and unharming, meaning if you were to pick anyone in the school and say, who's really the problem in this school that should be punished, it's often the top of the power structure or the bully. But the target of the big one is the most isolated one, is the smallest one, which usually represents the biggest blind spot in the cult. Meaning if you ask that little guy, hey, tell me about your life. Tell me who's sociopathic. Tell me about the power dynamics. Tell me about what the teachers are really interested in and not interested in this school. Tell me what subjects are being taught well and what are not being taught well. Tell me what things you're learning that could lead to a good life and what things you're learning just because the authority figures are too dumb to realize that they're dumb and are too dumb to update the curriculum to things that could really be useful in your life, like learning to drive, learning to build a house, learning to do plumbing, learning to landscape your house, learning to cook, learning to massage your partner, learning things that bring intelligent well-being, that lift the quality of life. They're too dumb to know that they're dumb. Could you explain that? And often the most sensitive, ostracized minority in the school can tell you all of that. And for this reason, they must be punished. Because the cult, operating more from the law of mass than the law of intelligence, cannot stomach its inadequacy, its stupidity, its incompetence. It cannot respond to that with love, with caring, with increased excellence. And so it turns on the witness. Inside, let's get drunk. What happens when you get drunk? Your witness loses all touch and the subpersonalities can do their thing. What happens when you get drunk? The critic is silenced or is allowed out. Now, there's a very delicate point as the reptile and the human come together. There's a very delicate point as the reptilian brain and the empathic brain meet in the mid-range of lucid thought, of pattern analysis, the rational brain. Well, spending an extraordinary amount of energy defending your house, defending your identity, pursuing legal action, defending your land, defending your right to go to this school that doesn't want you because you're black, your right to access public money that is being spent to tyrannize the public but should be spent to do this. There is a tremendous amount of conflict in the identities of the reptilian brain. Because when you are traumatized, one deepens one's intensity of identification with survival identities. Identities capable of defending themselves in a traumatic context. And this is the crisis as the human and the reptile meet. The human has empathy for the reptile, but the reptile does not have empathy for themselves or the other human. The reptile feels isolated, alone, and in its unhealed state. Now, when we say unhealed, what we're talking about is the traumatic wound in the incarnation process. As an infant, in that beautiful light, in that presence, in that timeless, nameless place before words, connected empathically and transcendently with itself, with the world, and with many things that don't fit into the cult paradigm. and in the first few months of life learned that it is born into a defensive, largely sociopathic environment in which the parent cannot attune to the child, doesn't want to attune to the child, and views the child, which is the greatest teacher in its access to the empathic and transcendent states, as being the student. So part of chauvinism comes from elevating the teacher above the student. The idea in a chauvinistic paradigm is that the teacher has something to teach and the student has nothing to teach. And extrapolated into parenting, the little Buddha crash landing into grief and horror has nothing to teach and is an irritant to the sociopathic reptile in the parent's mind. Now, in fact, both parent and child in a reptilian culture have something to teach one another. The parent must teach the empath, the transcendent one, how to be reptilian. Because in the meeting, mathematically, of an empath and a reptile, the empath leaves the door unlocked. The empath believes the scam story and says, here's some money. The empath believes the sex addict who says they don't have any diseases, they're sure of it, but doesn't want to wear a condom. And in that innocence of empathy, the childlike empathy of transcendence, interacting with a reptilian environment, more and more pain is transferred from the reptile to the empath. You have a slow transference process. First, I'm going to give you an STD. Then I'm going to give you poverty. Then I'm going to give you the shame of poverty. Because we could have poverty be a sign of any number of things. We could say, wow, you're poor, that's a sign that you need help. But in a reptilian framework, if you're poor, you are not as valuable a person as someone who's rich. So we're going to give you our valuelessness. Now, all of these are wounds of stupidity, meaning what we're doing is we're taking the most intelligent mathematical brain patterns and we're giving them the most pain. And at a certain point, the pain load of the empath reaches a point where it is crippling. It is an overwhelming amount of pain. Now, at that pain point, the empath dissociates from their humanity, their transcendence, and their empathy. This cut through the core of the self is amongst the most painful wounds you can give a human being. It's devastating. It's traumatic. It changes the entire identity. It leads to addiction. various forms of pain management. It is incredibly self-destructive for a cult to induce this sociopathic state in its infants and its children. But we do it all the time. And we call it growing up. And it's good that we don't call it adulthood, because adults don't traumatize their children and then nobilize the process and call it cult. Because all culture is an ecology of memes, an ecology of agreements of this is what we do. And those memes fit very nicely together. For example, if we have a meme of bullying and a meme of being bullied, they fit very nicely together. And they become a cult. It's hard to call it intelligent because it consumes vast amount of energy and produces negative amounts of human well-being. So it's not intelligent, but it is cult-like. We do it because we do it, because we do it, and that's why we do it. Completely self-referential. Intelligence references external values and data. We do this because this approach takes less energy, less time, money, and natural resources, and delivers higher yields of sustainable well-being than any other form that we could use. That's why we do this. And so we have the intersection of the cult and intelligence, of the empathic brain and the sociopathic brain, of the human being operated by their empathic brain and the human being operated by their sociopathic or reptilian brain. If you are a sociopath, you will transfer pain to anyone who will take it for as long as they will take it. And if you are an empath, you will take pain as long as you can take it from whoever begs you, demands that you take it. And the crisis at this crossover point in evolution between sociopathic behavior and empathic behavior is a crisis point of, it's really temperature or abundance. There are too many painful thoughts, feelings, attitudes, beliefs, behavior, words, paradigms, too many painful feelings produced by the cult. So the cult is the identity of the collective, and the ego is the identity that is enabled and demanded by the cult. Because all cults are dogmatic, and all dogma comes from fear, and all fear comes from pain, and the biggest pain of all is the pain of trauma. And sociopathic cults traumatize every one of their people to one degree or another. And so it is a self-sustaining identity, which is a habit. It's a habit of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. Cult habits are not based on intelligence, they're based on mass. They're based on the past. All fear of change, which is the fear of intelligence. Because if you give someone data that says sexually abusing your child will cost the economy an average of $1 million over 40 years, it will increase the amount of addiction, which correlates to the amount of deaths driving cars, which does this, which does that, healthcare costs, you name it. There's a long list of data. Could you stop molesting your child? We're not dealing with intelligence here. We're dealing with dissociative pain management. We're dealing with identity. I know who I am as a sexual abuser because I identified with the sexual abuser who abused me. And the reason I identified with my sexual abuser is my sexual abuser traumatized my identity as the victim to a point that left it unstable, that left it in tatters. My identity was violated to such an extent that the pattern of who I was deteriorated. And so I identified instead with my abuser because his identity, and whether it's a male or a female, the initiatory, predatory nature of violation is a masculine trait of the wounded masculine in relationship with the wounded feminine. If it isn't wounded at the point of connection, it soon becomes the violated feminine because of the law of mass. So what you see with the virus of perpetration is that the wound was given to someone small at an intensity that the small one could not hold on to their identity. Their identity collapsed. Their pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing collapsed in a sociopathic environment. In a sociopathic environment where the only thing you grasp is that you're going to be hurt by things bigger than you, you seek desperately to identify with a strong identity. You seek to identify with something powerful, something that could withstand the abuse that you just experienced. And the one identity that is clearly available in an abuse cult is the identity of the abuser, the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. Now it's available and it meets the need. Why? Because it has survived. In fact, every single time the rapist identity rapes someone, it gets stronger. Meaning an identity is formed by thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. The pattern of raping creates the rapist identity. But the initial rapist identity is often sought out for its perceived resilience by the innocence of the psyche as something that survives in a sociopathic environment. You see, 6-year-old little girls do not survive with their identities intact. Their innocence is shredded. Their stories about themselves are in tatters. they don't survive that identity. Now, whenever you violate an identity, it is a form of shame. The shame is a form of exposure, because the core self, the core witness, must wear clothing. Just like the electricity needs an operating system in order to send email. You can't just send electricity. I'll plug in, my 200 volts, you plug in your 200 volts, and you get an electric shock. Now, you need an operating system. And that operating system is identity. It's a piece of clothing through which, it's a pattern of energy through which light refracts. Now, an identity is chosen or foisted on, but there is a sense that this is me. Because the energy within me, to a certain extent, is ecological. I'm part of a vast planet, which is part of a vast solar system, which is part of a vast galaxy, a vast universe, a vast multiverse. And I'm just a very, very tiny iteration of energy in form, light interacting with light in a distinct pattern that is me, my identity. That's the only thing that makes me unique, my identity. It's the most personal, because it's my habit of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And what an abuser does is violates that. An abuser dishonors the identity. Here's your pattern. The abuser mows it down and continues. The abuser uses superior mass to say, you must conform to my identity. I have this form, and I'm important. You have this form, you're not important. Therefore, get out of my way. This is what's happening. Get out of my way if you want to. I'm not going to meet you. We're not going to explore. That's called romance. That's called friendship. That's called synergy. That's called love, where we explore each other's identity and find a way that I can be me and you can be you that brings pleasure, that brings safety, that brings value. And the chauvinist says, it's too time consuming. I'll just dominate whatever is smaller than me. I won't take the time to learn, to hear, to listen. I will just dominate. And you descend into the reptilian state. Now, why is it so fragile at this point of transition as an individual, as a cult, as a species, as a planet? Why is it so fragile? Well, it's that phenomena of one-sidedness in the sociopathic empathic relationship. First of all, there are more reptiles than there are empaths induced by the current cult. If you take all the different protocols, all the systems around the world, I mean, the banking one is a great one, because if you walk into your banker and you say, hello, Harry, we've known each other for 20 years, it's really bad. My husband broke his back, and his boss doesn't want to pay for it because he broke his back getting into the vehicle to leave the job site. Now, the vehicle was in this and this, but anyway, the boss doesn't want to pay the medical bill. And we believe that because of this and this, it was the boss's responsibility. We told him about this, we told him about this, those safety things weren't done, etc. We would like the boss to do this. The boss does not. Now, because Harry can't work, the boss has fired him because he can't work with a broken back. And in order to see that we got good medical care, we mortgaged this, we did this. But now we've tried to find good nursing, but Harry feels safest, and we want to be together as a family. So now I've stopped working to take care of Harry. And it's going to be about 17 months. We have no income. We have high medical bills. But what we need is a bridge loan. We need funding to get through 17 months, because if we have to lose our house in the middle of all this trauma of losing our job, losing this, losing routine, it's just going to completely floor our lives. Could you give us a $150,000 bridge loan so that we can gradually emerge stronger in 18 months and catch up on our mortgage and do this and do that and all this? The banker says, I'm really sorry, but precisely because you absolutely need that money, meaning there are few people in this town who need that money more than you do. Mr. Silfer, with his new $5 million third mansion, he doesn't need the money, but we gave it to him. Janet, with her gambling habit, with her rich brother who always pays her gambling debt, she doesn't need the money, but we gave her an extended credit line because the bank's making lots of money enabling her gambling habit, which her rich uncle always pays off. So she doesn't really need the money. In fact, she would be better off if we called the loan and got her a therapist to deal with gambling. But we're making money on her addiction, and so she gets our money. Now, you absolutely need the money. In fact, in the last 3 weeks, you need the money more than any other person we've approved loans for. But you know what? We are reptiles. Meaning our whole goal, the whole point of this conversation as a bank, is to determine if you really need the money. Because if you've got lots of other options, lots of assets and stuff, we will loan you money. But if you really need the money, and I mean you just no other way out, then we will decline the loan. And we're not really friends. I've just been friendly to you because you didn't need money until this point. But this is why I've been here for 17 years in our relationship, is for this moment, so that you would tell me that you really needed it, and you would lay out for me why you needed it, so that I can do the calculations about the odds and the risk factor of this loan. And so I can decide that Mr. Pilfer should buy a third Playboy mansion up on the mountains with his new stock dividends. But you should be forced into deciding whether to abandon your husband, whether to further traumatize the entire family by moving with someone with a broken back where everything's set up, just to further destabilize your routine. And nice to meet you. I'm a reptile. You're a human being. That system creates fear. It creates distrust. It creates rage. It creates massive amounts of grief and pain. You know, Phil, when you loaned us money for a condo investment. When you loaned us money for a car, we didn't need the money. We probably would have been better off just saving and putting it away, but you encouraged us to take out a loan, and we took your money for this and that, and we didn't need it. In fact, we would have preferred you to loan that money to someone who needed it. And now my trust in my government, my economy, and other human beings is lost. Because now I'm remembering all those gossip events. Did you hear that Mrs. Smith lost her house? Yes, I heard the bank foreclosed on it, and then she got kicked out of school, and then maybe she's going to end up on the street. Oh, well, that little hussy, all these little comments of people who communicated reptilian vibes, meaning not one of them went over there and asked if they could help pack or give some money or anything like that. It was more a little club formed to isolate the next victim. We live in a reptilian cult. And when you really grasp that program, that the cult's primary response to trauma and abuse is to blame, punish, and ostracize the victim, and never apologize for the cruelty of that. In fact, to nobilize it, toughens you up. You see, in a reptilian framework, there is a certain amount of that. Because if you think you're surrounded by human beings and you're surrounded by reptiles, then you're going to be in pain and in pain and in pain and confusion because you thought these were human beings. But the reptiles, following the latest technology in reptilian manipulation and extortion, Matthew McConaughey in his recent book, Green Lights, talked about the important learning that everyone in Hollywood is a reptile, meaning it's just business. If you've got 2 or 3 box office hits as a rom-com lead guy, you will have all your calls returned, and people will be polite to you, and people will want to have sex with you, and people will want to interview you, and people will understand you, and people will apologize to you. Oh, I'm so sorry for your mistakes. You will make a mistake, and they'll apologize for being near you when you made a mistake. And that's all politics. And as soon as you've had a few downturns, you could be a nicer person, a more intelligent person, and suddenly they don't want to have sex with you. They don't want to return the call. Suddenly, you made the mistake and someone else more famous couldn't make a mistake. And it's not human. It's reptilian. It's the brain's association in a reptilian paradigm that says that if you're around someone in high rank and high demand, in an ingratiating role, that your odds of survival and security in a reptilian environment go up. And so reptiles are very nice to ascending reptiles, and they're very cruel to descending reptiles. And that's the way that works. It's just about money. Well, it's a grief-filled moment when you grasp, as a human being, that the money that people invented as an idea that was supposed to be something that helped people. Meaning, money means absolutely nothing without the people that made it. You know, you think of Bitcoin. It's just 0.56128967836.6. That means you're an important person. It's just a gold coin which you have to lug around. Just a piece of paper with some green ink on it. This makes you an important person. Why? Because someone invented it, and then someone else gave it meaning, and then other people believed in it, and so it is important. Meaning we believe it's valuable, so it is valuable. But the question is, how solid is the mathematics of a cult that values a symbol of value? No, I mean, it's not even good cigarette paper. I mean, fine, you can roll up and, you know, with a $1 bill or something, but there's better paper out there. It's not the best writing paper. It's a little too thick. Credit cards are just plastic. There's no value in it. The value all comes from the belief in it. Now, the whole story of the golden goose and the golden egg was about a moral. The whole story of the golden calf in the Bible is about a moral. And the moral is that the golden goose is worth more than any one golden egg. And that the energy field of all that is more valuable than an idol, than the symbol of that form, because an idol is simply a symbol used to worship something bigger than the symbol. If you just worship all that is and say, thank you, all that is. I will never understand you. You're too big to grasp. You're too big to fit into a name. I'm too ignorant to even know what I'm ignorant about in the vastness of energy that is a small part of all that is that I'm aware of. I don't even know what I don't know. But thank you for the opportunity to be a tiny part of all that is in a crazy world that doesn't know what it doesn't know, but is learning. Thank you. There's no particular false idol there. There's not much to fight about. I mean, you could go and beat your neighbor up because they said, God got us all that is, and you just said all that is. Or if they translate all that is into Spanish and say thank you in Spanish, and you can say, no, English is the only way. You can get caught up in the false gods, in the false idols. The false idol is always the symbol of underlying value. This is where you get caught up in semantics without actually feeding the homeless person. Is that person homeless? Or is he disabled? Or is he culturally abused? Let him starve while we debate the symbol of the underlying asset. The Bible doesn't say that money is the root of all evil. It says that the love of money, the love of the symbol, when it exceeds the love of the underlying asset, when you value the derivative above the underlying investment, you tend to create problems. You tend to create unnecessary suffering. When you value bits of paper more than the human beings who invented it, you have an unsustainable mathematics. And the unsustainable mathematics looks like this. If you will kill, betray, extort, lie, cheat, give up on potential, and in every way elevate the symbol of value, money, over human beings who create all of the value, you will treat human beings worse and worse, and you will treat money more and more. As you treat human beings worse and worse, they will deteriorate, but your money will continue to grow. Until you finally sacrifice the last human, yourself, for your money. Because you're not that different from other human beings as core code. You cannot exist without the planet. And so if your code is so messed up that you think that bits of paper are more invaluable than human beings, and you let this person get cancer because, well, it allowed you to save $10 to the bottom line per product, because if you had bought the non-cancerous version of the product, or if rather than advertising that your product is the safest in town, if you had said, we sacrifice core ingredients to save $10 and give 2% of our clients cancer, then human beings would be benefited, but money would not. How can you ultimately exist as if human beings are less valuable than the money they make and consider yourself a valuable person? How can you connect with your innate value while making the trade-off day after day after day, money over people, money over people, money over people? But I'm a person. My money is more valuable than me. I will give up my own soul, my own sanity, my own health, my own time to serve money. Rather than people are more important than money. And I will have everything and give up nothing. But that is a transcendent state in a cult that punishes transcendence, that gets ready with a long list of cult defenses to dump the most pain on the most empathic people. And of course, the empathic people feel pain more than sociopathic people, because the sociopathic person is not innate. They are a human being who has dissociated from their empathy. And so there you have it. The sociopathic person has dissociated from their empathy. They've disconnected from their empathic brain. And in the process, they have become less than human. They have become dehumanized. Because the empathic brain is what humanizes the individual. The traumatized person is the empath who was given more and more unregulated energy in violation of their identity, to the point where they felt too much pain and overwhelm and dissociated. And then they've been left there in a dissociated state, often in a sociopathic environment, blamed then for being the victim. Because if we acknowledge that we are all responsible for perpetrations and victimization in our cult, beginning with high school or middle school, meaning, why don't we ask kindergarten students, is Daddy doing this to you? Is mommy doing that to you? Are you safe at home? Does mommy drink too much? Could we have a show of hands? Okay. We've now identified the 25% of our children that our cult sets up for systemic, sociopathic, brutal, traumatic abuse, rape, you name it. We now know who they are. It didn't cost a penny. But we're now going to do something humane. We're going to bring support to that family system. And we're going to acknowledge that it's not their fault. Because abuse is viral. We're going to acknowledge that if you have polio, you need medicine. Your ignorance is as much a virus as your trauma. Your pain is as much a virus as bulimia, as AIDS. And we're going to measure what's going on with these kids. We're going to attune to what's going involved, and we're going to participate in a release and a healing of cult identity. We're going to participate. We'll bring in a internal family systems therapist to get a sense of where is the abuse coming towards the child right now, and where did that come from? And we'll understand that it's government-induced. For example, in my family, my grandfather was given PTSD by a tank shell in France. He then gave his PTSD to my father, and my father gave his PTSD to me. The government, which sent him off to develop PTSD protecting our culture, has done nothing, not one penny. In fact, the US government taxes me at a rate of 30% for every money I spend on therapy. So if I want to heal the wound of my grandfather's tank shell-induced PTSD, and the shame he felt, the wound of shame, in a cult that made him feel helpless. That tank shell made my grandfather feel completely and utterly helpless. And the cult was ready with a soot load of shame. Meaning as soon as he felt helpless and was discharged into civilian life, the cult came along with 10,000 pieces of charcoal and dumped it all over his body, shaming him as a man for being helpless. And then left him to crawl out of that. And in the meantime, give that rage, that pain, that helplessness to my father. And then they left my father to deal with it. Not a single hour of competent emotional literacy in high school, middle school, kindergarten. In fact, my kindergarten teacher made it worse, sending children who had attention deficit disorder, and this was at the Hawthorne Valley Waldorf School in New York. The most traumatized children in American schools develop anxiety and attention deficit disorder because they don't want to be in their body while they're being hit by parents with PTSD. Just like those parents don't want to be in their body while they were hit with parents with PTSD. And we don't believe in emotional literacy for our teachers. And so Mary Louise Bedard, my godmother, would send me as a kindergarten student down into the dark basement of the Hawthorne Valley Waldorf School, and would say that I would be eaten by witches. And this was after my mother abandoned me, you know. When both parents have dissociative trauma coping mechanisms that do not allow them to feel, that do not allow them to bond with their children. And both parents physically hit their children. You have complete emotional insecurity and trauma being passed on by your primary caregiver. This makes you desperately clingy. It develops as attachment disorder, meaning the world is projected as a macrocosm of the abusive home and becomes overwhelming and terrifying. And these 5-year-olds are terrified of being abandoned. My mother carted me to the Waldorf school. I would be screaming and crying. She'd just leave me there. Mary Louise Bedard, having complete emotional traumatic illiteracy in a chauvinistic cult that doesn't believe in emotional literacy, just identified me as a sociopathic troublemaker, meaning when you are in a sociopathic state, you think about everything from your own point of view. Now, an empathic person grasps that a child needs the support of a big person. You know, it takes someone in a sociopathic state to sexually molest an infant because the law of empathy doesn't allow it. The law of empathy says, why should this little 6-year-old be forced to feel twice as much suffering and pain sexually and be confused and humiliated and disoriented for the rest of her life in a sexually and psychologically illiterate cult who will actually attack and gossip about her because you thought that your need for sexual release was more important than her whole life. You see, an empath cannot go there. It takes a reptile to say, fuck it. The old woman isn't putting out. I don't give a damn about anything else, and you'll do. That's a reptile. When you see a terrified, weeping 5-year-old dealing with attachment disorder by being put into a group of strangers after learning that people were people who hurt you. You see, traumatized children who are beaten, hurt, shouted at, raged at by their parents, they learn that people hurt you and that if you're smaller, you get hurt more than if you're bigger. So you're terrified of people. It's not irrational. You look out at the cult and you're terrified of people. I mean, you're particularly terrified of big people because they always hurt little people in a reptilian framework. You have psychological illiteracy, you have traumatic illiteracy, but meanwhile the teacher, the big person, has too much on her hands. Of course she does. She's surrounded by reptilian parents who do not receive a single hour of traumatic literacy. No one is giving the parents any help in this system. So of course they give their diseases. I mean, if you do not clear up chlamydia and you have sex with your partner, you give chlamydia to your partner. The parent is the abuse carrier in the cult. If every single step the cult does and does not do to leave the parent in an infected state directly determines how much pain and trauma is carried by the child, the infant, the adolescent, which directly determines how much PTSD develops, which directly determines how many sociopaths we raise in that generation. Because trauma is an intensity of pain that an individual cannot deal with alone, because trauma requires competent emotional and psychological literacy, because trauma is too painful to feel through the empathic brain. One must dissociate as a trauma survivor with PTSD from the empathic brain. In that dissociation, we are rendered highly intelligent reptiles too numb to feel. And that is systematically engineered by the cult. So what Mary Louise did with her fidgety, dissociated, traumatized kindergarten child was she would say that anyone who didn't focus and pay attention, that anyone who was in any way disruptive of what she was asking the child to do was be peaceful and centered in their body and then do what they were told. That's not something a traumatized child can do. It is a request made out of ignorance, made out of psychological incompetence. You have to diagnose the family system and heal the abuser before the child will stop demonstrating symptoms of trauma. So Mary Louise got no traumatic training at Waldorf School. She got no traumatic training as an American, as a mother, as a child raised in a sociopathic paradigm. So she did what any good sociopath would do. She understood that I was terrified and anxious because I was being beaten up by giants, because I was being abandoned by giants. Like my parents would take, first of all, they'd isolate us by being out in the wilderness so that they were the only people, no television, no contact. And this was institutionalized by the Waldorf lectures by Rudolf Steiner. So they completely isolate the children. And then they would, fly off the handle at each other. They'd fly off the handle at us. They'd shout, they'd hit, they'd punish. Then they would drive us crazy by behaving crazy. They were hypocrites in various forms, like, don't do this, and then they would do it. And then you would say, well, you're trying to get sane, right? Because they said don't do this, but they're doing it. So that's like saying A plus A equals B, and now you're saying it's C. Which is it? You're trying to get sanity. But in a shame-based parent who cannot admit their own faults and hypocrisy, they punish the child for illuminating their own insanity, their own hypocrisy. So they would say, A plus A is A. And then they would then say A plus A is B. And we'd say, which is it? We need to be sane. We need a code. We can't just say fish is a thing that floats in the water and then half the time it's something that flies through the air and is on fire. What is a fish? You cannot have sanity without integrity in the use of language, because that's integrity in the use of thought. But we raise schizophrenic, insane parents to pass on that schizophrenia to their children. And then the child is trying to make sense and then gets traumatized for pointing out the insanity. This creates a terrified, traumatized, weeping, little boy going to Waldorf kindergarten with his godmother. Now that alone is another form of insanity. Because if the godmother is the one who doesn't understand you, if the godmother is the one who hurts you, if the godmother is the one who puts herself above you, what does that say about God? All you know about giants and big things is that they hurt you and they're not fair and they're crazy. And then they pretend that nothing's going on. So what does that tell you about God? To call that the godmother. Well, Mary Louise said that there were witches and wolves and goblins under the kindergarten at the Hawthorne Valley Waldorf School in Upper New York State. That's what she said was in the basement. And in an insane trauma family, all of the deepest fears and horrors and things that cannot be asked are put into the dark. So the dark becomes a frightening place. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about that at dinner. Don't you sass your parents or we'll hit you. All of that has to get put into a dark place. All of that has to be buried in a dark place. The dark becomes frightening not because of its space, but because of what gets buried there and the fear and the hate with which it is buried by the abusers, who do not want it coming to light because they are afraid in a psychologically illiterate, sociopathic, shame-based abuse cult, all abusive parents will be punished. They'll be shamed in public, right? To the extent that you are a reptile, you won't wonder what's going on with Mary Louise's abuse history. You won't say, wow, what a poor Waldorf teacher. She did her best. But her best is in a cult that is committed to psychological ignorance. It's committed to not doing the most basic things to take care of a 5-year-old. And it's not good enough for what? It's good enough for survival. The species is growing along. It's good enough for cancer. Cancer consumes more energy than it gives off of its host body, and it grows rapidly. And cancer's final hour is the day before it kills its host, in which it has invaded almost all of the systems. And then its final stroke of glory. Let's grow even faster and consume even more energy of the host body. And then, oh dear, we consume just a little bit too much. The host is dead. Well, let's feed, right? Let's feed on that host. But you see, the blood is now not moving. The cancer is the very next thing to die after it kills its host. So the species is replicating relatively high volumes, and it's consuming more and more energy per capita. We have never consumed more of our host as a species than we do today. An American will consume 1,500 metric tons of CO2, 90,000 gallons of gasoline in the complete repercussions of manufacturing, consuming, transporting themselves, transporting what they consume, buying all the lumber and having it shipped, all of the gasoline and the manufacturing of the machines that manufacture the products. You know, it might take few thousand gallons of gasoline to manufacture a car, and a few 100,000 gallons of gasoline to manufacture the machines that can manufacture the car, and a few million gallons of gasoline to manufacture the factory that manufactures the machines that. So there's a long tail end of consumption so that we can get our little 5-cent bauble, our little 2-cent this or that. We are consuming more energy than any other people per capita in the history of humanity. And there are more of us on the planet than the planet has ever known. We have 2 exponential vectors that are moving us in a direction of cancer, in an understanding that we have not learned to heal cancer in ourselves. We have learned to create it. And a lot of the cancer we have created in ourselves has been in the process of creating cancer on the planet. Now, this shouldn't be a surprise because we are a fractal representation of our ecology. So if we have given cancer to 25% of the planet, it's mathematically probable that 25% of our people will develop cancer, either living in those cancerous environments or consuming the products created using a cancerous protocol. A cancerous protocol is a protocol that destroys its host body faster than it recreates the host body. If you do something or eat something that destroys your body faster than it recreates your body, it consumes your body, you've just introduced cancer. If you engage with your ecology in a way that consumes more and more energy and gives less and less back in the form that that ecology needs for balance, like if you cut down more trees than you plant, you are now a cancer in your host body. We haven't even mastered that. So we may, like so many cancers play out for our benefit, be the last to know. Meaning cancer is moving right along, progressively, expanding, never-ending growth. And then the host body collapses. The systems of the body, the ecology collapse. Now this system no longer works. The liver no longer clears the thing to this. So now this one gets worse. The trees do not regulate the temperature anymore. So high winds result and knock down more systems in a deregulating and collapsing organism. More and more things become deregulated and collapse, leading to more and more systemic collapse. And the cancer keeps growing, keeps celebrating, keeps getting bigger. We're making it. Let's get another 20% growth this week, this month. And then the host collapse. Finally, can't make it up another day. Cancer is so excited, just feeding frenzy. The body is not fighting the cancer anymore. But just a few minutes after that, the cancer starts to collapse because the body is no longer feeding it. Well, we don't teach our children intelligence. We don't teach our grown-ups' intelligence. We don't raise adults. So Mary Louise would take her traumatized students and send them into the basement in the dark, where all those horrible things which your parents were too frightened to talk about. You see, I didn't become frightened of all these subjects. And what sex? It takes all of the grown-ups around you looking furtively and panically around before you got to believe it must be terrifying. If there isn't a single sane person and they're all running the world, it must be scary and terrifying. So sex goes into the bag. We don't know anything about it, but it's too dangerous to talk about. If insanity, hey, you said this, but now you're doing this, is too dangerous to address with a 6-year-old, it must be pretty scary. So, okay, it's life-threatening. When you challenge the taboo as a 5-year-old, and the giant, in a state of overwhelm, panic, and despair, shakes the life to within an inch of death, you get, for some strange reason, that topic is traumatic to the people you depend on, so it better be scary for you. God will punish you and this and this. He doesn't seem to be bringing any light lakes of fire in this. How dare you question the Lord thy Father? Blah, blah, blah. Okay, I guess that goes in the bag too. Meaning every single thing that the grown-ups are too dumb, too hypocritical, too scared, too shame-based, and too psychologically illiterate to even talk to a 5-year-old about, goes into that dark place with the message, if it ever comes out, your life is in danger. It's called insanity, it's called the shadow, it's called trauma. And then that's where Mary Louise Bedard, the godmother, likes to send her pupils to be eaten by witches in the dark. Go down there, you will be eaten because you're a bad boy. There's nothing wrong with the dark. There's nothing wrong with the cellar. At least you get out of the sociopathic cruelty of a godmother. The problem is the belief. Because if you are surrounded by buffoons, from before you can have language where every time you go towards this feeling, every time you express anger, for example, your parents' eyes tighten. They speak gruffly. They shake you a bit more. You learn these people hate anger. They hate this. They don't like this. They can't. You learn before words how to exist. What do you do when they refuse to make it conscious? Because if you make it conscious and say, well, you're right, your mother is a hypocrite. She's a hypocrite because your cult is a hypocrite. You see, your politicians are hypocrites. They say that all the laws should be followed and this and that and the other. And then they meet in the back room and they give their families secret deals and they start up little backroom meetings and they take bribes from the Chinese and the Russians and this and that and the other for political influence so that you'll use your power to do what's good for the Russians and the Chinese and what's bad for America. So your politicians are hypocrites, and they won't talk about it because they'll lose their jobs if they say, yeah, I'm a hypocrite, I take bribes. But if they lie about it, the public tolerates it. And so they're lying, illegal hypocrites. And they depend on that hypocrisy to get rich at the expense of the American public. And so we're hypocrites because we're doing the same thing. Meaning we want to break our own rules and do this, and we don't want to do what's best for you a good chunk of the time because we're traumatized narcissists. And besides, we're jealous of you. We didn't get any decent parenting when we were growing up. You know, now we have all these rules, you have to do this, otherwise you're not a bad parent. We hate you, you fucking son of a bitch. Look at what you've set us up to do. You make us have to do this, and then we look bad when you're screaming. God, I hate you. But we can't say that. So we talk about how much we love our parents. We send our, we bought them a new wool coat that they hate. We're forcing them to eat vegetarian organic broccoli for their own good. We're doing all this stuff, but we don't want to deal with this stuff. And we don't want to look bad to ourselves, and if you tell the truth or ask us about this, we'll feel really dumb. So we're just going to hit you, and we're going to hit you again. I'm going to shut you up in every way possible. And then when you're a parent, you'll get it. This is how you bully and feel powerful as a parent. And once you do it, because usually, if you cannot confront the abuse, you'll do it to the next generation. And we're not going to let you confront it. So there's pretty good odds you'll abuse your children as well. Then we can have it in common. We all secretly abuse our children. So it's into that dark place that don't sass back, don't talk back to the teacher, don't talk back to the cult. This little boy goes, wondering what is it in this dark place, this unknown, this treasure of mystery. What is it in here that is so terrifying to all these grown-ups that they won't even explain why it's terrifying? It must be terrifying. What is it? And you can't ask, and they won't tell, which is lonely, which is painful, which is terrifying. And so, the 6-year-old is asked to carry what the 40-year-old won't. The 6-year-old is asked to carry what the teacher won't. The fears, the taboos, the insanities, the cruelties, the abandonments, and the pains, and the lies of all their past generations of their government, and they're taught to their government's their friendly government looking out for them, and they're taught that their parent, whatever they do, that was love for your own good. May feel upsetting, may feel terrifying, lonely, bitter, but that's parenting for you. Grow up and be like us. Well, I was further traumatized. Then my 3rd grade teacher died. So I went completely numb. I remember the day it happened when my father said, he walked up to me. Of course, he didn't know how to feel or grieve because he's a traumatized American male. He walked up to me and he said, you know, Dane, your teacher, Uta, is dead. And I just went completely numb. He didn't hug me. He didn't model how to feel or grieve anything. He just said, she's gone. And I remember when I dissociated completely from empathy. It was such a relief. It's the Novocaine coming on in a toothache. When the Novocaine erases all the pain, you can bite on your cheek. You can bite a hole in your cheek. Just push in, chew away, and create a hole. It's fascinating. There's no empathy. There's no feeling. You've dissociated this area of the body from all feeling, enabling you to manage pain, but also enabling you to abuse yourself and not realize it. The reptile abuses themselves and their ecology and doesn't realize it all the time. I could feel nothing. The trouble came with the anxiety of that numbing wearing off. And so I became more fidgety, I needed to distract myself from an overwhelming feeling that no one in my circle was competent to hold space for. Because my parents had already told me in infancy, the number one rule in this family is thou shalt not feel. If you feel, we will hit you. If you make us feel, we will humiliate you. We are going to give our pain to you. My parents would play abandonment games in the forest. It was so exciting for them because they could take little 5-year-olds in complete isolation out into the woods. Hee, right? Let's run and hide. Isn't it exciting? For a traumatized, abused child with no other support to have repeated abandonment games. And then we'll send you off to school and abandon you at school. And then your kindergarten teacher, your godmother, can abandon you in the basement so that you can be eaten. And of course, you're isolated with all of these reptiles, and so you don't really have any context. There's no news and media because we're doing this for your own good too. Let's just bar the child from all media. And then in 3rd grade, I began getting really fidgety, trying to stay away from the feelings I was not allowed to feel because they threatened 2 psychologically illiterate parents who didn't want to touch their own feelings. It threatened them too much. They went to pieces around feelings. A child can't afford to let their parent go to pieces because they've got no one else. And so I held the anxiety, the hyperactivity that would allow me not to feel what was illegal to feel. Of course, there was no one else in the school that we could feel it was. It wasn't like my parents took me to counseling or took me to a grief therapist or said, here, let's study the 5 stages of grief and why we're so terrified of going through them ourselves. No. Don't feel anything or keep away from us, because that's the consequence. If you feel anything, we will punish you by sending you to your room, and you'll be abandoned in isolation. But then if you go to school and you demonstrate the hyperactivity you use to stop feeling something, we will punish and abandon you some more. So we have sent into the cellar to be eaten by witches in kindergarten, and then we have the substitute teacher saying either Dane leaves or I'm quitting, because he knew nothing about trauma either. Now, notice that it's always the lowest ranking person, in this case, the traumatized child, who takes the brunt of the incompetency of the big people, none of whom apologize, not one of whom say, you know what? We don't know how to help you grieve. We're terrified of our own feelings. We're regularly traumatizing you. We're asking you to go crazy. And then we're filled with so much shame that we deny all of this. And even though by our own standard, if bad people deserve to be whipped and punished, we should be whipping ourselves and punishing ourselves every day, we're not going to whip and punish ourselves because it's more funny to blame it all on you and whip and punish you for demonstrating symptoms of our abuse, for not being happier. You're not grateful. Gratitude is a spontaneous feeling that emerges around competence and love when adults are present. Traumatized, abused children don't feel anything other than fear, let alone great gratitude. But that doesn't stop the cult indoctrination of the Christian community church. It's just another area to make the child feel that they're bad. Dad reading the Old Testament, emphasizing that story where the father, the great Lord, asked this shepherd, right, to take his son, raise his sword and cut him in half to sacrifice for the Lord. So, God's a sadistic, masochistic gang leader himself. He doesn't tell the child ever to sacrifice his parent. That might be a little bit more healthy. But prove your loyalty to the Lord by cutting your child in half. So this was one of Dad's favorite pieces because it kind of communicated, son, just so you know, for your own good and because I'm a good Christian, God could call upon me as a upstanding member of this community, of a righteous person. God could call upon me to sacrifice you. Here's my sword, and I have a gun too. Now, the Lord was merciful this time. He said, you've proved you've proved you can join the gang. You were willing, without any reason, to sacrifice an innocent child on my altar. That's good enough for me. You've passed the test. You're in the gang. Come on, guys. We've got another reptile. Here's another one willing to cut his children in half to avoid upsetting the alpha god, the big croc. It's utter bullshit. But it is taboo to say so. It doesn't get any crazier. But here we are. So the little boy is then expelled from third grade Waldorf school for managing the grief feelings his parents weren't willing to deal with. And he gets sent to psychological examination. There's a wonderful woman, Mrs. Kennefic, in Harlemville, New York area. She lived about 20 minutes away. Wonderful psychologist. We'd go up there. It's the only place I could drink ginger ale. So it was wonderful. Ginger snaps and ginger ale. And so, anyway, we'd have little conversations. And she created a diagnosis of what were the presenting symptoms. And this is largely what child psychology does, is it puts into Latin names all of the presenting characteristics of the child. Now, the child already knows what they're doing. The parents and the teacher already know what they're doing, but they don't have Latin names for it. So I think we spent 10, 15 hours or so with Mrs. Kennefic, and she writes her report. Dane is like this, and he's like this, and he's like this. And he's like this, and he's like that. Well, what is news about that? Well, there's a dissociation involved with this naming. You could just ask a hyperactive child, why are you so scared of being in your body? In an environment that lets the child know that you don't have to go home if your parents will beat you for having feelings. That we'll take on the job of getting your parents to feel their own feelings and take them off your back. You just have to be honest, because we're not afraid of feeling feelings. You're a child. And you deserve access to your full emotional range. The thermometer of the human heart does not lie, but it may be misinformed by the grown-ups, by the addicts, by the trauma survivors around you. You may have a misinformed thermometer that has been fed false information that's generating all this fear. But the dark is not filled with witches that will eat you. And having intense feelings is the most human thing imaginable. And we're going to address the idiots in the room, the people telling you all this stuff. You shouldn't be carrying all this stuff. Get it off of you. And we'll deal with that. And we won't let your parents get a hold of you until they can apologize for all their cruelty, for all their ignorance. It's not personal. They're just sick. It's not personal. They're just sick. And the sick do not deserve to be punished. They deserve medicine. We're going to put you first. You're the child. You're going to get the medicine of sanity, of empathy, of caring, value. We're going to give that to you. But then we're going to give it to your parents. We're not going to give them the ability to hurt you again until they know what they're doing. How about that? It's wonderful. Oh my goodness, the relief. But instead, kicked out of school, and now the other parents perceive guilt by association. So here's the kid that was kicked out of school. So he's isolated, traumatized, and being punished by the system for having a teacher who died in a family that doesn't know how to grieve and is frightened of feelings. That's a pretty poor, terrified little boy over there. Let's give him a hug. Let's welcome him. Let's invite him and make sure he knows that he belongs. That's empathy. That's intelligence. That's psychological literacy. It's not what happens. We don't want you playing. That's a bad boy over there. He was expelled. Don't be like that. Don't play with your friends. Let's further isolate the trauma survivor, because we're too dumb to be human beings to an 8-year-old boy who cannot grasp and process the layer upon layer upon layer of trauma, abuse, stupidity, and the overwhelming cruelty of denying it. The overwhelming cruelty of denying it. You see, children that tell the truth about these things are not doing it because they want their parents to be punished. That's the cult. That's the internalized abuser of a parent raised in a sociopathic cult. The child is often empathic and sensitive. Don't feel bad, Mommy. You are a terrible parent. You did hurt me this and this, but we can move on.